Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today I'm excited to bring you a conversation that weaves together the worlds of creative direction, storytelling, and transformational healing. Today's conversation features Liz Chernett, who brings 17 years of creative direction experience to her current work as a psychedelic integration coach. Drawing from her background in fashion and wellness, Liz shares how combining authentic storytelling with transformational coaching creates powerful containers for healing and growth. We dive deep into the art of integration, exploring her innovative Art for Essence workshop and a new podcast that she just launched, In Right Relationship. Liz is a graduate of our Practitioner training program, is based out of Philadelphia, and has been trained in inner team dialogue, and also draws from transpersonal psychology, shamanic frameworks, and Jungian archetypes. And she specializes in helping clients to navigate psychedelic experiences through authentic storytelling and creative integration. In our conversation together, Liz and I discussed the power of being a generalist in creative and healing work, how early psychedelic experiences shaped her approach to grief and transformation, the mystical experience of childbirth during the pandemic that catalyzed her career shift, understanding projection and storytelling in healing work, her innovative Art for Essence workshop approach to creative integration, and building community in Philadelphia's emerging psychedelic scene. All right, before we get into it today, here's a quick word from our sponsors. Hey folks, this is Paul F. Austin, founder of Third Wave and the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And after 15 years of exploring psychedelics' transformative potential, I've learned that direct experience is irreplaceable, especially for those that want to work professionally in this space. And that's why our Practitioner certification program features something unique, a week-long intensive at Reunion, a world-class retreat center on the beaches of Costa Rica. This isn't just another online certification. You'll participate in psilocybin ceremonies, yoga, meditation, and hands-on leadership training, all while being guided by our world-class faculty. This transformative experience is included in your tuition, part of our comprehensive 10-month training program that combines cutting-edge psychedelic education with practical coaching frameworks. You'll learn directly from me and our pioneering practitioners who are shaping the future of human potential. Position yourself at the forefront of this third wave of psychedelics while gaining direct and embodied experience in a supportive community of forward-thinking practitioners. Ready to elevate your life and your practice? Learn more about our Practitioner certification program and apply for our next cohort at psychedeliccoaching.institute. That's psychedeliccoaching.institute. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Liz Chernett. Before we went live, we made a bit of an outline of the general direction that we would like to cover. And one word that I wrote down as you were talking about this metaphor, which we'll unpack throughout the podcast, was generalist. You know, there are people who are specialists who almost like a PhD level expertise, and they go very, very deep into a topic and it's one thing. And then generalists are much more, they spin webs. They're synthesizers. And I just love to hear for you how, as a generalist, how was being a generalist helpful in your, professional career, specifically your corporate career, when you were doing a lot of work in New York with different brands and helping them with storytelling and creativity? How did that sort of generalist approach serve you?
Well, I've always been attracted to newness. I've always zigged and zagged. I've always identified with, the Ouroboros and, wiping the slate clean and starting fresh. That's something I've done many times in my life. It just excites me. So I think inevitably just sort of identifying that way and that being part of my constitution, naturally, I'm on this ongoing journey of just learning different things, following different passions, different pathways. In terms of my corporate career, I think it served me in that I was able to reinvent a whole bunch of times. So I started my career doing consulting, essentially trend forecasting and future scenario consulting. It was super fun. It was, showing brands across all different segments, how to essentially future-proof their businesses, their offerings, their products and services. And, and then from there, I transitioned into a career in fashion, in styling. So very, very different. But, after years of kind of like building decks and being in boardrooms, I was like, I'm ready to like roll my sleeves up, get my hands dirty. So I'd always really been passionate about photography. So I was able to transition into that and worked in-house for brands like Old Navy and Levi's and kind of all-American brands, working on TV sets and all that good stuff.
Fun.
And then from there, I was able to transition more into art direction and creative direction. And I had a photo booth company for a number of years, and
cool.
I've just tried a lot of different things. So, I mean, I guess it served me in that I've realized that I can do that. Like, I mean, it's like whether I think I can or I think I can't, I'm right, right? So it's like I've just tried, and yeah, I mean, I think otherwise, it's you mentioned the web, and that's I think really at the crux of my psyche, if you will. My power animal is the spider, and that's been shown to me in medicine space a number of times. And actually, if I think back to an early ayahuasca journey I had, dropping into the portal and sacred geometry, what was shown to me was Indra's web, actually, or Indra's net.
What's
And
Indra's net, Liz? What is that?
So Indra's net, as I understand it, is a Buddhist metaphor for understanding the universe. It's like a three-dimensional spider web comprising all of existence, all beings across all lifetimes. And within this infinite net, there are infinite nodes or jewels. And each jewel has infinite faces and is, in essence, like a hologram of the whole. And the idea is that the more one gets in touch with who they really are, the more they project their light out onto the net, and the more they refract or amplify the light from other jewels. So it's a way of understanding that, we're all interconnected as one, and that each of us is an infinite sum of infinite faces. Just sort of linking that back to your question about being a generalist, I sort of see myself as, the spider spinning my web, and all my different interests and passions and things I've tried are different radial lines, on the web. And as I make my way kind of spiraling around these lines, there is a method to my madness. But it's true to say I'm not the, what was your word? I'm not the expert. What was the word you used?
The specialist.
The specialist. I'm not the specialist. Yes, I'm a specialist of novelty.
Oh, that's good. That's a good thing to be a specialist of. I feel a kinship there. I am much more of a generalist as well. There are particular things that I love and I go very deep into, but broadly I love sort of this web weaving. Now, interesting side note, they did research, I don't know when this was, it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, where they gave spiders different drugs. Right. And not only did they give them different drugs, but they also gave them different amounts of drugs. And so they found that when they gave a spider LSD, that it wove together a more perfect web than when it was just in sort of the sober state. What's been your relationship to LSD? Like, has it been something that you've enjoyed or explored? I feel like with people who have a more creative sort of novelty seeking lens, that LSD is quite nice. What is that kind of molecule meant to you?
Yeah, I love LSD. By far my favorite thing to microdose.
Okay.
Today is a dose day for me. So
you too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I was 18 the first time I did a high dose acid trip, and it just completely like ripped me open,
Okay.
in the best way. And for me, yeah, I love the way that you tied in like the spider and the web, because it is the consummate molecule for connecting the dots and weaving thoughts into existence and weaving the ephemeral with the material and the spiritual with the profane. I just did a high dose acid journey not long ago, and God, it was so wild. Yeah, I sort of experienced myself as shape shifting. I was in the woods. It was kind of a vision quest of sorts.
Okay.
And yeah, I just had some really trippy things happen where I sort of experienced myself in two places at once. And yeah, I love that molecule for sure.
Okay. So LSD, fantastic. You've been working with psychedelics yourself for, pre-corporate career, obviously. It's not, you weren't one of these people who got into it later in life. You jumped on the bandwagon pretty early. Why come back to this then as a more professional pursuit, professional career? You did quite well and you were quite successful in the creative and storytelling sort of place. Why set that aside for psychedelics and working in a more sort of coaching and transformational space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing is just depends on how you define success. I mean, perhaps on some level I was successful, but for me, just unlearning this paradigm of success equals achievement, achievement equals accolade, right? Like I don't identify with that the way I once did. For me, success looks like full expression of my gifts, of my passions. Being entirely who I am, being entirely authentic, right? So, yeah, I think at the crux of this is really a question about authenticity and um, not being better, but rather being more myself, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I started exploring with mushrooms as a teenager, and immediately these early experiences were just very catalytic.
Mm.
So I think I was drawn by, your average curiosity. This is going to be awesome, just, a planned escape, if you will. And it wasn't, these were journeys that carried me deeper into myself. My father passed away when I was 10, very tragically,
Mm.
very unexpectedly. So my early experiences with the mushrooms really opened that well of grief and, created
Mm.
space for me to really process a lot of unmetabolized loss, to sort of understand that experience through a new lens, maybe a bit more of like a mythic lens. Not that I had the vocabulary for that at the time, but also really opening me to the realms of the unseen. I grew up with some, I would say, like religion light. I went to Jewish summer camp and things like that, but it wasn't particularly spiritual, right? So these were experiences that were really opening me to the mystical, the spiritual. So, being that those were my earliest psychedelic experiences, I think it was, perhaps a foretelling of what was to come many years later, maybe a foreshadowing on some level. But they were so powerful. They were so catalytic, layers of my being fell off, new layers were exposed. So I think that since that was my initial reference point, it really gave me this understanding. Obviously, this is years and years before, psychedelics were part of the mainstream dialogue of healing and expansion and growth, right? And I continued to experiment over the years. I definitely did my fair share of, acid at a music festival, or, MDMA at a party, or lots of partying hard in college and more recreational experiences for sure. But I kind of always had this tried and true spiritual practice with the mushrooms where I'd say like once a quarter, I would just take a whole bunch of mushrooms, put on some amazing music, make my little nest in my room, and yeah, kind of cry it out, laugh it out, puke it out, journal it out. So I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just doing what felt right, and during the college years, also friends or friends of friends would come to me and ask me to be their Sherpa for their first mushroom trip or their first psychedelic experience. So I did plenty of that in college. So again, this kind of foreshadowing of what was to come many years later. So the foundation was there. It was like, I think this was my path all along. I just didn't know until later. I wasn't ready to integrate it, or, however you want to look at it.
I have a very vivid memory when I was, I believe, 19 or 20. I was in college and in a fraternity and selling weed at the time. And my weed guy also happened to have basically a lot of other things. And he happened to have a lot of mushrooms. So I remember one time I bought probably like a pound of mushrooms or something like that. And I brought it, we would have this once a week fraternity meeting. And so I remember coming downstairs and there's like 30 or 40 of us and just going up to the front and holding this big bag of mushrooms in front of everyone and telling them, okay, we're going to go do a bunch of mushrooms in the woods. And, I think a week or two later, there were like 9 of us that went out into the woods of sort of Saugatuck Dunes, like that area, and did a bunch of mushrooms. And it was cool to see them come together and have those experiences. And I found in college it's just such a rich time for making that happen.
Yeah, so true. So true. I would, as I mentioned, I would often do the mushrooms in my room, and I had this obsession with checkerboarding my room. Like every room I ever lived in, and I moved so many times, every room I lived in between the age of 18 and 25, I would checkerboard. I would like go to Michael's and use their paper cutter to cut like 1 foot by 1 foot black squares and white squares. And I would like assemble this checkerboarded environment, in part because I knew I was going to trip there. But also I think just this like some kind of symbolic understanding within me of light woven with dark, the shadow and how that fits into the spaciousness and the light. And so it's just funny as we're reminiscing about this. I'm taken back to my my sort of Alice in Wonderland inspired checkerboarded walls. So intense.
Indra's net in its own way.
Yeah, right.
So you've recently launched this podcast in right relationship with Lily, who we've had on the podcast before, Lily Akers. You both went through our second cohort that we had for the training program. That happened almost 3 years ago now. So we were in Costa Rica at Brave Earth together almost 3 years ago. You've just recently launched this podcast, but the last 3 years for you have been a lot of growth and sort of evolution within the space. What has it been like the last few years as you've gotten deeper into working with psychedelics and plant medicine? How have you seen your own practice start to grow and develop as you've gotten deeper into this space and this work?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I can honestly say I've never been as fulfilled in my work as I feel now. But not only that, I've never felt as much myself, which is really significant for someone who has been working in the creative industries, for nearly 2 decades, right? Because there's so much creativity and so much expression that has come through that work as well. But this just feels like total alignment with my earth assignment. Like this feels like it's what I'm supposed to do, right? So yeah, just to feel that level of alignment is so transportive. It feels like I've opened this door to infinite possibilities, which isn't to say that, I certainly have had many periods of contraction. This is weighty work. It's deeply, deeply challenging work. The stakes are high, and this is such sacred, delicate work. And there's just so much responsibility to do this work and integrity and to be careful and to be skillful and to be on one's own path, doing one's own work, right? But that said, the extent to which being on this path has allowed me to go deeper into the well of my own transformation alongside the witnessing and holding space and, creating guidance for others in their arc of transformation is just hard to put into words, honestly. Yeah. And, I found myself here I mean, I guess there's many things that happened along the way that have led me here, but kind of one of the most pivotal moments that opened up really the conviction and clarity for me of pursuing this path was a mystical experience. And actually, it was an experience that I had without any medicine. And it was the experience of childbirth, of giving birth to my son. So as I was initiated into motherhood, I guess I'll context that a little bit. I was about 6 months pregnant, living in New York City when the pandemic broke out. And at the time, I was helming a team at a startup. It was a growing startup, doing really well at the time. And the team was big and growing. And, the stakes were high. It was a lot of pressure. And I felt this sort of existential angst that I had felt pretty consistently over the years of like, oh man, I'm like climbing this ladder that's leaning against a wall and I'm not really sure this is the wall I'm trying to scale. And, I've kind of always had that feeling, or I had always had that feeling over the years. And, sometimes the volume would turn up and other times it would be turned down. As I told you, I zigged and zagged a lot trying to like make things kind of fit and click. But so anyway, yeah, I was 6 months pregnant and I went into labor on June 1st, 2020, right? So COVID is raging. I was at a hospital right downtown Manhattan, right at City Hall. And that was the day that the George Floyd protests erupted, right at City Hall. So here I am, I'm in this bed on the ground floor of this hospital, right at City Hall, and the protests are erupting, and I'm like, oh, why is this happening? Like, what? Like, I should be out there on these streets. Why is this happening? Why am I bringing this baby into this world? Like, oh my God, so much dysphoria. And essentially what happened, as I'm birthing my son and incarnating this being, I essentially had the experience of passing through my own birth canal. Hard to put into words, but it was like direct communion with spirit. And the message was essentially, you know exactly why you're here, right? And you just need to step in. You need to step in and it's time. And it was really about stepping into a fuller expression of the healer archetype in me and a new expression of the creator that I hadn't yet explored as intensely. And, all the work that I've done leading up to that in corporate and whether it was having my own business or, leading teams in-house, I just loved working with people. I loved mentoring people. I loved collaborating and making magic with people. So, I already knew that was really something that lit me up. So it was just sort of like all the dots connected. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen during this experience of like the childbirth and sort of giving birth to myself all over again. I couldn't unhear what I'd heard. And it was like, okay, working with other people, creating magic, storytelling, psychedelics. And, this whole experience also linked back to a journey experience that I had years ago. So it was just like everything coalesced. And it was like, oh my God. It was like this crossroads between all the should stay on, should vest all my shares, should do this, should do that, and I must move on. I must allow this rebirth to happen, essentially.
And you must be in right relationship while doing it, right? That's why you named the podcast probably what you named it. Well, I mean, what does that phrase mean to you, in right relationship? Why'd you choose that as the name of the podcast that you launched?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge this is a podcast that I am doing with our dear Lily Eggers, who is, another cohort mate from the Psychedelic Coaching Institute and a dear, dear friend and a couples therapist. And we loved the name In Right Relationship because essentially for both of us, that's what integration is about, right? Everything is a relationship, whether we're talking about, relationship to ourselves. And that breaks down to like, infinite angles, right? Relationship to our breath, relationship to our body, relationship to presence, relationship to spirit, relationship to others, relationship to our work, relationship to the future, relationship to the past. It's just essentially life is just an infinite rainbow of relationship. So how can we be in right relationship with all these various facets, right? Like going back to Indra's net, it's like, each node in the net has infinite faces, So how can we be in right relationship with each node, each face, and also with the totality of the net?
And by different faces, are you now referring to parts work, or by different faces, do you have something else in mind? Because I'm trying to keep track of
Oh, that's interesting.
what you're weaving.
Yeah. Yes, I think you could certainly look at it that way.
Well, there's these
I think
internal parts, right? There's the multiplicity of self.
Sure.
There's the
Yeah.
different aspects of the internal work, but there's also the external. Okay, we can't just be navel gazers necessarily as psychedelic enthusiasts. We also have to look at what are the webs that we're weaving, and keeping kind of relating or relational, the sort of relational lens as the sort of center point of how we live.
Yes. I think you could certainly overlay the idea of parts work on Indra's net. Absolutely, right? And like just all the different selves and parts, the symphony of selves that each of us is. I think there's a number of other overlays as well, even just thinking about mythos and archetypes. But again, that sort of links up really nicely to parts work. So I think there's a lot of different paradigms or frameworks to kind of explain this idea that we are all really, limitless internally. So yeah, and parts work has been such an expansive modality for me personally. Just better understanding my parts, bringing them into greater harmony, and then also getting trained in the work. So I'm level 2 certified in inner team dialogue, and I've also been pursuing my own kind of self-guided study in IFS, and just being able to bring in that framework sort of as scaffolding for clients with psychedelics, with the prep is super, super juicy. And then even in the journey experience, right? It's really powerful when people are able to understand a part of them that is amplified, a part of them that is coming forward, asking for healing, asking to be seen, to be witnessed, to be heard from. Or perhaps there's, kind of a war of attrition between two parts, right? And just understanding what's happening through the language of parts is really transformational. So that's been very expansive in the work.
So you lean on parts work, you lean on, I think you work within sort of a somatic and creative realm. And a lot of the thread that you weave is this thread of storytelling, which I don't think we've talked enough about yet. So how is it that, if you're working with a client or someone wants to come work with you and, you're helping them with preparation, maybe facilitating a journey, supporting them with integration, how are you weaving storytelling into that? What is the role of, choosing a new story, or deconditioning from our old stories, or picking an inspiring story, or how do you sort of create a lens around storytelling for folks who you work with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, for those of us who are in the psychedelic space as professionals, this idea of storytelling is pretty foundational and something we talk a lot about. But for a number of folks, they're not thinking about it through that lens. They just have their thoughts. They have their sort of like running monologue or their narrative about who they are, who they're not, or the hand they've been dealt, or their life circumstances. And that's just what it is. Right. And so a big part of it is just getting distance, right? Is being able to like zoom out and see one story first at a distance, right? Sort of like removing some of the personal layers of it and almost kind of seeing it a little bit more archetypally or symbolically. And I find that's sort of like step one is just like zooming out and sort of seeing the story from 30,000 feet rather than being like inside the story and really identified with the protagonist of the story, if that makes any sense. And that was like a really pivotal part, has been, I should say, a really pivotal part of my own personal healing journey. And I think ayahuasca has been very supportive to me with that, of just understanding my own stories through a new lens, understanding the ways in which my stories are defining and contouring my reality or keeping me separate from certain dreams or desires. So, I think just creating spaciousness and almost like wedging some space in between the person and their stories is kind of where that begins, right? Again, it's like whether we tell ourselves we can, whether we tell ourselves we can't, we're right. So it's like just first waking people up to that, right? And stories lead to deeper feeling, yeah, so they amplify the emotions that are there. They can sort of bring to the surface shadow feelings that are repressed, right? And so through just like the experience of telling a story, it's like the sediment rises to the surface and we get to like skim it off the top and work with it, right?
So what's coming up is the Eleusinian mysteries. You're familiar with them enough, so I don't need, and our listeners are as well. I don't need to go into deep detail. But that was, they were these mysteries that would happen in ancient Greece, and essentially it was like immersive theater, right? So you would drink this kykeon or kukion, depending on how you pronounce it, and then you'd experience or be immersed within the story of Demeter and Persephone. And I think it's a really beautiful way when actively working with psychedelics to participate in this group experience and group environment. In fact, a friend of mine is recreating these mysteries, and I attended it earlier this year, and it was the immersive theater element was really profound and super interesting to experience. And I think that's also the opportunity in ceremony and sacred ceremony is there's a story that's being woven around that. That story is rooted in ritual and lineage, right? It has sort of anchoring in things that have been talked about for a very long time. And that creates a space where folks can reinvent themselves, right? There's a lot of magic that can be done if we just have that space. What I'm hearing you say is this sort of space of responsiveness. There's a gap between who I am and what I perceive.
Yeah, I think that's one way of putting it. And I think it's just being able to tell a story from the sort of objective third party narrator versus being inside the story, right? Like versus being like, I am the protagonist and the protagonist is me, right? Can we zoom out enough to see that this is just a story that one part of us may be telling, or, a cluster of parts within our psyche are telling, and that like we could tell any story we want to tell. It doesn't have to be this story, especially if it's a story that isn't serving us or is holding us back or is keeping us stuck or is making us suffer or is, undermining people with whom we're in relationship or keeping them contained within a certain role within our life or, what have you.
So what's the role of projection in the stories we tell ourselves?
What's the role of projection in the stories we tell ourselves? Well, I mean, I think projection is pretty much everywhere, right? We're constantly projecting in pretty much every relationship and, in many, many moments, right? And so the beauty of that, when we can, admit that to ourselves, is we can start to work with our projections and see them as symbolic and representative of our shadow or parts of us that are wanting attention, parts of us that are wanting healing or wanting to be better known and understood, right? Before we hopped on, we briefly were talking about the anima and the animus from Jungian psychology, right? And understanding that within each of us is an inner marriage, right? And an inner marriage of divine masculine and divine feminine. And some of the qualities are unclaimed, right? And throughout the arc of our lives, we integrate these unclaimed aspects of our divine feminine and divine masculine, right? So the ways in which we project onto, let's just say, a romantic partner, right, may be indicative of our anima or our animus, right? For a woman, the inner man, right? Or for a man, the inner woman, right? And how that breaks down. And, there's different archetypes and kind of typologies within the anima and the animus. But once we can just open ourselves to the reality that we are constantly projecting, I think the better we can attune to ourselves and the people with whom we are in relationship, really.
And I would say there's a lot I want to expand on in this. The place that I'll start with is one of, I think, the greatest aspects of self-awareness or becoming more aware of the self is the discernment between what is projection, what is maybe boundary, or what is discernment, right? That ideally, sort of a metric of growth is we recognize more and more what is true and not just a projection of our shadow or our inner psyche. And I mean that, when we're talking projection in the pejorative sense, there may be healthy forms of projection that help with survival at certain points in time. Robert Bly, who's a well-known writer, he wrote Iron John, and then he published a series of essays called The Little Book on the Human Shadow. He talked about how we carry our shadow in sort of bags around us. We put more and more things in the bag as when we're young, the practices and the patterns that weren't lovable, right? And so we kept putting those things in the bag. And as we then individuate and grow into adulthood, we'll have a really, really heavy bag. And so what he talks a lot about is the necessity to look in that bag. And he'll talk about it as a metaphor, like eating the shadow, right? And the more shadow you eat, the more projection you eat, the more gravitas develops, the more depth you have, the more wisdom that starts to percolate. And I think the anima animus is also a really good example of projection. He talks about it in terms of the inner witch, how the man will have the projection of the inner witch inside of him, that the wife. And I think with a man versus a woman, it's like an inner giant or something like that. And so it kind of brings in these mythical creatures who have these certain aspects and ways of being that, we don't perceive as necessarily positive. And so much of what he talks about in relationship, right, like in marriage, is recognizing what is projection. What are we projecting about our wife that our mom used to be or do, or, or vice versa.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And obviously, like, much of this is really personal, and a lot of it is collective as well, right? So our projections are also indicative of the collective psyche, and the conditioning and, the times and all this kind of stuff, right? I think it was Terence McKenna who said, right, like, every time we venture into the unknown ocean through a psychedelic experience, we're like fishermen, bringing back ideas to feed the village. Right. So these projections.
I had not heard that quote before, Liz. That's fantastic. I want to look this up now.
I hope I'm getting that right. I think.
Can you say that again? I'll find it. I'll find it for sure. About catching fish and bringing back
ideas. We're like fishermen bringing back ideas to feed the village.
It's also very Jesus metaphor-y, because Jesus would often talk about Terence McKenna, fish swimming in consciousness. Yeah, he would often use the metaphor of catching fish and bringing it back to the village to describe the role of shamans and psychonauts in society. The fish represents the insights, visions, or knowledge obtained from psychedelics, and the village symbolizes the community or society at large.
Yeah. So it's just interesting to think about, again, just the holographic nature of our projections. Like, yes, a lot of it is personal, and it has to do with our family of origin or our life experiences or our traumas and, all this kind of stuff. And also they're representative of the collective, of our culture, of our times, of the zeitgeist, and so on, right? So, one of the most powerful aspects of transformation, or I should say, one of the most powerful aspects of psychedelic-assisted transformation is the way psychedelics help us really elucidate our projections, right? And sometimes we need to turn them way the fuck up in order to understand the meaning, and then we can kind of unpack it and bring it back down, So I just that's an interesting idea, I think, with this, or that Terence McKenna quote sort of speaks to that for me. And then there's also that links up with the sort of mythic tale of the salmon, right? Like, just to run with the Fisherman quote from McKenna. And Simon Ugler talks about this in his book, Psychedelics and the Soul. But the idea of the salmon, right, which starts out its life in this tiny tributary and swims upstream until it makes it into the big ocean and lives all this life, and all these things happen, and then it returns, to its tiny tributary in the end, kind of brimming with new knowledge and new understanding, right? So we're all like salmon, and I think projection is really the process through which we enter the ocean.
and swim upstream.
Mm-hmm.
It gets us through. So you've now got me on a Terence McKenna kick, Liz. So I'm thinking of a quote as well from him. It comes from his first book, Archaic Revival, which is more of like a collection of talks and interviews that he gave over the years. And there's a chapter in there that's him speaking at Esalen. This is in the 80s. And Ralph Metzner, you may know Ralph, was there in attendance, and Ralph asks him a question about, is everyone meant to do very high doses of psychedelics? And basically, McKenna says that only a small percentage of people, perhaps 5 to 10%, are naturally inclined or prepared for such profound encounters. And he emphasizes the importance of personal readiness and the potential challenges these experiences can present, advocating for thoughtful consideration before engaging in this. And this is sort of not everyone is meant to do this, right? There's certain people who are ready to go and swim in the stream of consciousness, and become fishermen or fisherwomen or fisher people. I think probably the politically correct term now is fisher people. Would you say that's?
Thanks for that.
Yeah, that would be a point. So more and more fisher people can do that. And so this kind of leads me to one of my final questions is like, who do you feel most called to support with? Who do you find the sort of greatest joy in working with? Who is it that you love to bring through these experiences with psychedelics and sort of work with in this collaborative way?
Well, I wouldn't say there's one particular avatar I work with, but, of course, there's common themes amongst the folks who find themselves in my orbit. I love working with people who are interested in rewriting their stories, whether it's reframing their orientation to their family constellation or reframing their narrative about what's possible for their lives. Quite often I find myself working with folks who are pregnant, not literally, but spiritually, they're gestating a creative gift to the world that wants to be born. And I would say too that I'm very much drawn to the mythopoetic archetypes and the language of symbol. And I love working with people who can appreciate that and open themselves to the truth at the center of the image they were born with, which is a line from a David Whyte poem that I'm totally in love with.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. One thing we haven't talked about yet is Art for Essence, which is your new workshop that you recently debuted at a retreat that you hosted. And we were talking about it, before we went live, but I'd love, and I think the context here, the lens here is like, this is it is your own creative story that you are weaving in. It's like a very good, I think, representation and explanation of when Liz is thinking creatively and what she's bringing into a space. This is it. That's my sense of it. So what is Art for Essence? How did that gestate? What is the intention behind offering this and facilitating it?
Yeah, well, it's a really a work in progress offering, and it's something I'm co-creating with a friend of mine who is an art therapist and a conscious dance facilitator. The idea of it.
There's conscious dance facilitators?
Yes,
I didn't know that.
Course.
Oh, that's great. I'm gonna write that down. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard of static dance.
Well, it's not really ecstatic dance. It's like
5 rhythms?
It's adjacent to 5 rhythms, let's say. Yeah.
Adjacent to 5 rhythms?
Adjacent. It's a different one. Have you heard of like Root? There's some different ones. There's a lot of different ones. There's another one called Continuum. So anyway,
I would love to do a podcast on this, the different conscious dances. Sorry to interrupt.
That could be interesting. Yeah, there's so much out there nowadays. But yeah, so the idea of Art for Essence is to create an experiential, immersive workshop for integration. So as you mentioned, we ran it out in Utah not too long ago. It was sort of an add-on to a retreat that Sonia and Shelley were running and facilitating, a vocal activation retreat and medicine work. And essentially, we did like several iterative sessions throughout the retreat that entailed mixed media expressive arts with guided movement and embodiment practices. And I want to leave a little bit of suspense around what it is that we created, but we always create something, and it's always, a tangible art piece takeaway that is utilitarian for integration. So, so it can look a lot of different ways, and it can be a standalone workshop or experience. It can also be, an addendum to a psychedelic retreat or a yoga retreat, really any kind of, spiritual or transformational gathering, enabling us to really drop into the right brain, the imaginal brain, and just express from various parts, right? And to sort of like put on the canvas the nature of our experience, either in the medicine work or in that expanded state. So that's the idea of it. And I think, we're playing with lots of different media, right? So, and all different sorts of kind of creations that we do throughout the workshop. But high level, the idea is to create something that is then usable for ongoing integration and reflection.
Art for Essence, working title.
Yes.
But it sounds like something I would love to have at a retreat experience. I'm not, we offer different integration activities now as part of the retreat, but the more sort of unique workshops we could weave in, the better. So this sounds like a really good offering for folks who might be interested in bringing their retreat with psychedelics to the next level. Okay, so we talked about the podcast. We've talked about spiders on acid, which I think was my favorite part of our conversation. You being a generalist, creative storytelling, Indra's web. One thing we haven't talked about is where you live. You live in Philadelphia, which is, I wouldn't say it's rare, but I also wouldn't say it's common, at least for those who are in the plant medicine space. A lot of the folks I know, they're in Cali, they're in New York, they're in Florida, maybe Austin, Texas, Denver, Portland, Seattle. Philly is not usually on the list. And so I'm curious, like, what do you love about Philadelphia, and how kind of what's the current status on psychedelics and how people perceive them, and the just general vibe in the Philly area?
Yeah, totally. Well, for the most part, I grew up here, and Philly was a rad place to grow up. It was super integrated and very progressive. It was sort of like Brooklyn before Brooklyn was Brooklyn, if that makes any sense,
Okay.
It's the land of the Black lesbian rabbi, and it's vibey. I'm telling you, it's a great music city, amazing food city, great art city. Well located on the Eastern Seaboard. So I'm in New York all the time. I hop on Amtrak. It's an hour and 15 minutes, for example. But I'm only just now really tapping into the psychedelic community here. I'm blessed to have such robust community in this space all over the world. And obviously being part of the Third Wave family has been so instrumental for building that community. So it's kind of a good problem to have, is that I don't have like an immediate need to build community like in my backyard. But that is top of mind for me. That's definitely one of my core intentions for 2025 as it relates to my work and this practice. Building my web right here. So recently I started to connect with more folks in this space locally, and there's some people doing really, really, really amazing, cool things here in Philly in the psychedelic space. So more to come on that. I'll have to update you as things continue to sort of unfold and transpire. But I did make it to the Philadelic Conference, which is the University of Pennsylvania's psychedelic symposium. I think it's in its third year, and I made it to one day of the Philadelic Conference this fall. It was Brian Mirarescu who was the keynote speaker, so that was great.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So there's a scene. But I would say, like, I also feel pretty connected to this community in New York as well, and have often sat in ceremony with people in the New York area or upstate, so there's a lot nearby. And actually, one thing I love about Philly too is it's just a very like unpretentious place. So it's like you can know someone a long time, or you can just have really rich, authentic conversation with, let's say, your neighbors, and not even talk about work, right? It's not like so what do you do in the city? Like in New York, that's like within 10 seconds of meeting someone, that's, that's generally what work comes up. So I very much appreciate that about Philly because people are very themselves and it kind of has an egalitarian feel to it for that reason.
I do like the sort of historical underpinnings of Philly. The two cities on the Eastern Seaboard are really like it's Boston or Philly, and I think a lot of people would agree with me that Philadelphia is a more interesting, sort of diverse and culturally rich place. I mean, I love Boston for what it is, but having spent a little bit of time in both cities, not much, right? Maybe at most a week in each city. I really loved walking through Philly, and Benjamin Franklin, right, was in Philadelphia. His printing press was in Philadelphia. I'm sure there are a bunch of other people that I just can't remember off the top of my head as well. Who lived in Philly.
Yeah.
But
it's a rad place.
It's a rad place.
It's a rad place. I live on Hermit Street, which is no coincidence. I ended up buying a house on Hermit Street, and I live within walking distance to an old growth forest. And in said forest, there's this cave. It's called Hermit's Cave, and there were these Gnostic monks that would sit in this cave and meditate. I think this was like in the 1680s. There's a plaque and everything. So there's a lot of provenance, and there's
because the Quakers are also from Philadelphia, and the Quakers
right.
are sort of the mystic sect of Christianity. A lot of the mysticism is from the Quakers.
That's right. And I actually went to Quaker school. I'm really grateful for that experience because going to Quaker school was totally rad.
Well, that sounds like another podcast.
Thing. Yeah, indeed.
Quaker school. What was okay? What's the TLDR of Quaker school?
Well, the idea of the Quakers, their core belief is really that there's that of God in everyone, right? So there's really no hierarchy. In a lot of Quaker schools, you call your teachers by their first name. We engage in a practice called meeting, right? So meeting for worship, which is something we had every week, where essentially we're all just meditating and kind of co-creating a meditative field together. And if you feel called to speak, you're welcome to speak. But, meeting for business and meeting for, everything was like a meeting and very non-hierarchical. The Quakers are nonviolent.
Pacifists. Yeah, that's what they're probably best known as. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and just encourages a lot of authentic expression. And yeah, it was a really beautiful, very safe environment in which to grow up. When I was in middle school and high school, there were several kids who were openly gay, and that was a lot more rare, in the time, like in the 90s, early 90s or whatever. So yeah, I feel really, really grateful for having grown up in that environment. It definitely catered to a full expression of self.
That's beautiful. Well, Liz, thank you for joining us for the show today, the podcast today. You have a personal website, but you also have more of like a website for your coaching, if I'm not mistaken. So if folks want to learn more about you, which direction would you point them in?
Yeah, definitely. So my website is kaleidoscopecoaching.com.
EYE, right?
EYE. Yep. We don't yet have a website for the podcast, but we are live pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify.
In right relationship.
In right relationship, yes. And I want to also just mention, if it's okay, that we would love our community of listeners to contribute to the podcast. So certainly for any of you out there who are hearing this and you want to come on, we bring on all sorts of cool experts and guests in the field, healers, coaches, clinicians, spiritual healers, anyone who brings a unique lens or angle on psychedelic integration. But we're also putting together some more short form episodes that are inspired by the Moth Slam stories. So 5 to 8 minutes long or so, where people are able to submit, just recording on their phone, just a personal story, a personal anecdote about a journey that really changed you, and how you integrated that. So it can be free flowing and messy and imperfect. And we will, kind of get our editor, give him some creative license on, cool music that evokes the feeling and the sensibility of the journey story. And, kind of making that part of the offering of the podcast as well. Alongside the lens of integration is just, kind of some personal stories, almost like a podcast form of Arrowhead, if you will.
archival.
Yes, that's a great word. Archival, anecdotal and archival.
I love it. So In Right Relationship is the podcast. Kaleidoscope Eye Coaching. You can also just go to our website. We'll have links to everything from this show. So if you want to check out more about Liz, you can do that. Again, Liz, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This was a ton of fun. And I would encourage listeners to reach out and follow In Right Relationship. Go download a couple episodes. Hopefully I'll be a guest on at some point.
Yes, we can't wait to have you on. Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Hey listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Liz Chernett. A quick reminder to head to the link in the description of this episode to see the full show notes and any of the links that we mentioned in this episode. We'd also love to know what you thought of the conversation, and you can let us know in Third Wave's community, our free platform where you'll find support discussions as well as educational resources. Go to community.thethirdwave.co. Make sure to follow the Psychedelic Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found this episode to be inspiring or helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on the intentional and responsible use of psychedelic medicine.